off your videos if you haven't already done so. That includes me.
Okay, we're live.
Great. Good evening, everyone. My name is Hannah Rowe, and I'm the 2020 Census Manager for the Austin Asian Complete Count Committee. Thank you all for tuning in and joining us for this virtual town hall conversation on the recently released PBS documentary, Asian Americans. We're especially honored to be hosting this conversation with our distinguished panelists, Dr. Madeline Xu from UT Austin, Samip Mallick from the South Asian American Digital Archive, Ashley Cheng from Rouser and the Rabble podcast, and Sri Preston Kulkarni, who is currently running for Congress in District 22 of Texas. Asian Americans is a groundbreaking documentary series that premiered on PBS this month. While the timing of this release coincided with Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, this documentary also arrives at a time when we are witnessing the scapegoating of Asian Pacific Americans during this global pandemic. But these patterns of scapegoatings are not new, and it is all the more crucial for us to turn to history to understand how we got here and what we can do today to ensure that history does not repeat itself. While I'm sure most, if not all of us, have already seen the documentary, here is a short preview of the series. Just bear with me here while I turn this on.
I'm here today, so the rest of this world hears our story. For 4.5 years, my family was incarcerated. The government framed it as an issue of loyalty.
Many people lose everything. Asian voices were so inspirational.
They had to assert their rights.
The railroad could not have been built without the Chinese.
We fought on the side of the United States. There was a shift in political power.
Asian Americans were free to do anything they wanted. All hell broke loose.
The city burned.
They were trying to build a life for themselves.
I grew up with the American dream.
You've got young people fighting to make change happen. If a lot of people put their mind to it, they can win.
It was an incredible time.
And their legacy belongs to all of us.
This is our story.
So we are back. As the series producer, Renee Tajima Peña has recently said, this documentary is, quote, not about how Asians became Americans, rather it is about how Asians shaped America, end quote. And that is why the series is so groundbreaking in that it has shared previously underreported or perhaps unknown stories of Asian Americans to a mainstream audience. From the stories of Chinese laborers in the 1850s, including the grandfather of Connie Young-yu, to the inner turmoil of Japanese Americans like Buddy Uno, this series invites us to consider what it was like and what it's still like to wrestle with questions of identity, belonging, assimilation, and intergenerational trauma. There is, of course, so much more to unpack, which is why we're gathered here this evening with our speakers, who are pioneering scholars, activists, and leaders. While we have to maintain a virtual format for this town hall conversation, we invite you all to share your comments and questions on your live stream page throughout the event. We will also have the first hour to hear from our speakers, and then we'll spend the last half hour or so of this town hall for a more open conversation. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce the work of the Austin Asian Complete Count Committee, or the AACCC. The AACCC is a civic engagement organization that was formed in 2019 to ensure a complete count of all Asian American Pacific Islanders in the greater Austin area in Travis and Williamson counties. We aim to engage, inform, and motivate the AAPI community in greater Austin to participate in the 2020 census, the effects of which will be felt for years to come. We are a diverse coalition of Asian Pacific Americans, and we believe that civic participation can truly empower all of our communities. We're also pleased to be joined by the Houston Asian Complete Count Committee for this event. We're really proud and honored to be working alongside the Black African American Complete Count Committee, the Hispanic Latinx Complete Count Committee, and the LGBTQ+ Complete Count Committee. All of the Complete Count committees are working tirelessly to ensure that each and every one of us gets counted so that all of our communities can have the resources needed for the next 10 years. So without further ado, it's my great privilege and honor to introduce all of you to our speakers today. Our first speaker is Dr. Madeline Hsu, Professor of History at the University of Texas at Austin and former director of the Center for Asian American Studies. Her first book was Dreaming of Gold, Dreaming of Home, Transnationalism and Migration Between the United States and South China, 1882 to 1943, from Stanford University Press. Her most recent monograph, The Good Immigrants, How the Yellow Peril Became the Model Minority, from Princeton University Press, received awards from the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations, the Immigration and Ethnic History Society, the Asian Pacific American Librarians Association, and the Association for Asian American Studies. Her third book, Asian American History, A Very Short Introduction, was published by Oxford University Press in 2016. She's also written the anthology co-edited with Madeline Marinari and Maria Cristina Garcia, titled A Nation of Immigrants Reconsidered, U.S. Society in an Age of Restriction, 1924 through 1965, from the University of Illinois Press in 2019. Professor Hsu is president of the Immigration and Ethnic History Society. You can visit her most recent project, Teach Immigration History, at immigrationhistory.org. Thank you, Madeline, for joining us. If you can wave and say hello so that our viewers can see you.
Oh, hello. Thank you, Hannah, for inviting me to participate.
Thank you, Madeline. Our next speaker is Samip Mallick. Samip is the co-founder of the South Asian American Digital Archive, or SADA, and since 2012 has served as its executive director. Working at the intersection of technology and storytelling, Samip holds a bachelor's degree in computer science and a master's degree in library and information sciences. Samip was previously the director of the Ranganathan Center for Digital Information at the University of Chicago Library. Samip has also served on the Pennsylvania Governor's Advisory Commission on Asian Pacific American Affairs and the advisory boards for Asian American Studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago and the University of Minnesota Immigration History Research Center's Immigrant Voices Project. Samip, thank you so much for joining us. If you could wave and say hello to our viewers so they can see you.
Hi, everyone. Very glad to be here today.
Thank you, Samip. Our third speaker is Ashley Cheng. Ashley Cheng is the co-founder of Rouser, a creative civic engagement company that was named 2019 Organization of the Year by the Travis County Democratic Party. She co-hosts the Rabble podcast, and you can find this podcast at the Rabble TX, serving up a regular helping of progressive Texas politics with a side of this is how you get stuff done, plus glitter and friendship bracelets for dessert. Their new In Quarantine series debuts this June, called The Rabble in the House, a live quiz show where the answer is always to stop flipping out and start flipping the Texas house. You can learn more at www.rousertx.com. Ashley, if you can turn on your video and say hello to our viewers.
I didn't know you were going to have to read that bio I sent you out loud. I apologize for like a break in the professionalism. That's kind of how we do it with the Rabble. Hi, guys. Thanks for being here tonight.
Thanks, Ashley. It was great. His bio is great. Our final speaker of this evening is Shri Preston Kulkarni. Shri is a Foreign Service officer who represented America abroad under Presidents Bush and Obama. Shri is ready to flip Texas's open 22nd congressional district When President Trump divided Americans following the white supremacist march in Charlottesville, Sri decided to come home to this district and run for Congress to bring people together in 2018. Campaigning in 16 languages across a quickly diversifying district, Sri expanded the electorate, grew the immigrant vote, and came within 14,000 votes of defeating Congressman Pete Olson. Raised by an immigrant father and a mother who traces her Texas roots back to Sam Houston, Sri left the University of Texas to care for his father when he was diagnosed with leukemia. After his father's medical bills brought his family to the brink of bankruptcy, Sri became an advocate for quality, affordable healthcare. If elected, Sri will be the first Asian American congressman from Texas. In Congress, he'll seek common ground, find solutions, and make sure every Texan has a voice in Congress. Sri, if you could turn on your video and say hello to our viewers.
Hi, everybody. It's my pleasure and my honor to be here, and I hope you all will help us to flip Texas 22 in whatever language you speak.
Thank you, Sri. So we have quite the lineup of speakers this evening, and we're so grateful that you have all joined us today. So we're going to turn to Madeline first. So Madeline, beginning in episode 3, the documentary discusses the emergence of the model minority myth. You've written extensively about this topic. Could you help us unpack what it is and what is the historical context in which the model minority myth emerged? What does it mean to deconstruct the model minority myth today? And how can we unpack our own relationship to this myth? So Madeline, to you.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. So the model minority image is, I think, presently the overwhelming perception that non-Asians have of Asian Americans. And it's a really pernicious sort of trap for Asian Americans. It really emerges after World War II in the context of the Cold War, but also the United States is trying to shed its reputation as a segregationist, racist country. And a lot of this some of it has to do with domestic pressures around civil rights campaigns, but a lot of it also has to do with the United States becoming very conscious that in its competition against the communist world for the support of emerging third world nations. And so decolonization is going on. There are a lot of Black, brown, and yellow peoples who now have their own countries. Their countries have their own governments, and they have a platform in the United Nations where they can voice certain kinds of complaints, that there actually is pressure for the United States to demonstrate that it is in fact a functioning, racially inclusive democracy as it has represented itself to be. And it's in this context that we will have this repositioning of Asian Americans. Now, as the documentary does a really wonderful job of demonstrating the ways in which before World War II, Asian Americans were racialized and excluded as immigrants, as foreigners, in parallel with Black and brown and also indigenous peoples. The fault lines, though, in the case of Asians, so Asians were the first targets of immigration restriction in the United States. And so the foundations for how immigration laws operate, but then also the diminished status, rights, and protections for people who are aliens, who are present in this country, but who are not citizens. You also have people who have, you may have temporary legal visas, but many people are also in this country without authorization, that you, in fact, institutionally have diminished rights and protections, are subject to things like detention and deportation. This gets carved out with regard to the Chinese exclusion laws that the documentary talks about, that the federal government claims this kind of authority, but also this working out of unequal status for aliens and illegal immigrants. And so this is why in the 21st century, we have so many people who are vulnerable to being rounded up and also being expelled because of the kind of status they have with regard to how they entered into this country. But what happens with the Cold War period is that there is a reworking of this. One, you have the easing of the Asian exclusion laws. Asians are now allowed to get citizenship. And there also is, during this time period, a realization, a coming to terms that you can use your immigration laws actually, that it's not that productive to focus your immigration laws on other countries and other peoples by race. This is too overtly discriminatory, but you can also use your immigration laws to try to select for other kinds of attributes, such as education, such as employment, and that you can remove the sort of the undesirable laws that single out Asians on the basis of race and national origin, and in fact, most non-white persons on the basis of race and national origins, but you can use your laws to try to bring in people with certain kinds of education and skills, especially during this time period. People lodged in STEM fields are in the competition against the communist world, very so necessary in terms of economic competitiveness, but also necessary in terms of things like the defense race, like the space race, and that you can use your immigration laws to select for these kinds of immigrants, even as you diminish your emphasis on race and national origins. And this is the kind of rethinking about immigration policy that goes into the 1965 Immigration Act. This kind of migration is often termed brain drain. The brain drain was starting even in the 1950s. If we look at international education in the United States, we will see growing numbers of Chinese, actually Taiwanese, Indian, Korean students. We will also see growing ranks of Filipinos arriving as professionals. And this is made into permanent law in 1965. And so what we have is as everybody is highly, highly visible, right? We have this incredible growth in terms of the Asian American population, which is now disproportionately arriving through the employment category, right? And so we basically have the importation of a highly educated middle and upper middle class population from certain countries in Asia. There's a lot of economic pressures. In many cases, there's a lot of political instability that people are fleeing from. And so the immigration laws really feed into this developing model minority stereotype. But another key component of the model minority stereotype is that there is a shift in the racialization of Asian Americans, right? And this is one of the things that starts setting apart Asian Americans and removing them from the parallel track with African and Latino Americans, in that they are increasingly positioned as sort of highly achieving, having very strong work ethic, this focus on sort of careers and attaining middle class life, with being very law abiding, so not participating in civil rights era campaigns around rights, and so being repositioned. And then serving as, and there are the statistics in the aggregate which show Asian Americans to be so highly performing. But serving as a very powerful kind of fodder that, in fact, the United States can function as this multiracial democracy, that all it takes is sort of hard work and sort of focusing yourself appropriately on certain kinds of employment, certainly not trying to challenge the existing system and to call out various kinds of inequalities. And it's a very pernicious kind of image, because as so many of us know, there are many Asian Americans who are not in a position to accomplish all of these sort of access into middle class life. Asian Americans are still very readily racialized as foreigners and as threats, as the pandemic situation has vividly illustrated. But the model minority stereotype also acts as a trap for Asian Americans, because it actually celebrates Asian Americans for striving for what many people actually really do pursue. You sort of want a kind of a affluent lifestyle. You want to have satisfying work. You want to be able to have good education for your children. You want that nice house in the suburb. But sort of this very kind of success then sort of embeds you further in the kinds of inequality, and then also sort of management of racial minority groups that is ongoing in the United States. And so this is, so in the documentary, it addresses sort of problems with the model minority stereotype, but it doesn't address, I think, as fully the post-1965 immigration and the ways in which those many Asian American activists and civil rights campaigners actually, after 1965, will find themselves sort of overcome, right, and swept over by the reality that the Asian American immigrant population will soon outnumber those who are US born. And they arrive under a very different set of circumstances, a very different political situation. Many will not have shared in this longer history of discrimination and marginalization. So it's a very, so the Asian American population is incredibly complex, and how we negotiate, you know, it's also very prone to being fractured. And as I'm sure you've run into trying to run the census counts and try to do outreach to many communities. I mean, you know, AACCC and also SRI are having this experience where it's actually quite, there are many fault lines. But this is sort of, so the Asian American population has become transformed, right? And so this 5-part documentary series is highly, highly commendable, but we just have so many, just such a diversity of experiences and histories, and then also current conditions that it's you know, some of us will find ourselves reflected in it. And the hope is, I think, that we can draw the common threads. But, you know, and so this is, I think this is a great discussion to be having about that. So I'll just stop here.
Thank you so much, Madeline, for sharing this really complex history in such a concise and a clear way for us, and unpacking that for us. I do want to come back to this question of the model minority myth at the end during our more open conversation. But I want to now turn to Samip Mallick. So Samip, the documentary introduces us to the stories of South Asian Americans like Bhagat Singh Thind and Vaishno Das Bagai. What kinds of materials from SADA were used in the documentary? And can you also give us a brief overview of South Asian American history, including some of the major events that are underreported in our US history textbooks? So I'm going to turn it over to you to guide us through this, this next segment.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really want to just once again, thank you for inviting me to be part of the conversation this evening. And also wanted to mention a couple of friends in Austin, Sumit Dasgupta and Ashwin Katalia, who connected us initially. Thank them. And also wanted to recognize one of our board members who's also based in Austin, Aisha Khan, who's the Asian American Community Archivist at the Austin History Center. So SADA is an organization with many Austin and Texas connections. I was actually meant to have been in Austin last week, and I'm obviously very sad to not be there in person with all of you, but glad that we can convene virtually in this way. Hannah, so responding to your questions, yeah, I thought, you know, in my remarks, what I could do is first give a brief overview of the South Asian American community and our community's history, and second, share a bit about what, you know, why it's so important for us now to engage with that history as a way to activate and energize our communities today. And third, why I think it's so critically important for us to think of ourselves and our place in the historical narrative. We are clearly at this moment living through a historical moment with the pandemic, with the upcoming election, with what's happening in the country. And so to not think of history as something that happened only in the past, but to realize that we are also making and living in history right now. So I thought, well, first, let me tell you a little bit about the organization, the work that we do. SADA is an independent nonprofit organization that's based in Philadelphia, which is also where I live and work, but one that works nationally to collect and share stories from the South Asian American community. Those of us who trace our heritage to India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, Maldives, as well as the many South Asian diaspora communities around the globe. I'm going to try to actually share my screen so I can share some images with you from the archive as I talk a little bit about the community. And I will just give me 1 second to do this, please. Hannah, do you mind nodding your head if that's working, that you can see my screen? Okay, perfect. So I thought that what I'd do is first share a quote with you from a scholar of archival studies who talks a little bit about why it's so critically important for communities like ours, communities that have been marginalized, overlooked from the American historical narrative, to have access to our own records, to have access to our community histories. Her name is Jeanette Bastien, and here's what she says about why that's so critically important. She says, a community without its records is a community under siege, defending itself, its identity, and its version of history without a firm foundation on which to stand. And we actually started SADA 12 years ago now, back in 2008, really recognizing that our community, the South Asian American community, like so many other communities, has been overlooked, have been excluded, and as a result, we haven't had access to our own stories, to our own records, and I would argue for that very reason are also under siege in the current political and social climate in the country. There are, as you would likely know, doing this work much more than I do, now nearly 5.4 million individuals in the US who trace their heritage to South Asia. And if you do the math, I think it's important for us to think about how substantial that number is, thinking specifically about the South Asian American community. So one way to think about it is that 1 in every 100 Americans traces their heritage to South Asia. Another way to think about it would be that if all the South Asians in the country were to live in one state, it would be the 23rd largest state in the country, almost as large as the state of Minnesota, larger than the state of South Carolina. And of course, thinking about the work that SADA does with documenting community histories, if there wasn't a Minnesota Historical Society, there wasn't a history of South Carolina written in thousands of books, we would think that's incredibly problematic. But for communities like ours, in the South Asian American community, and the Asian American community more broadly, most people outside of our communities don't think twice about why our stories aren't being represented or told. It's really up to us to advocate and tell our own community histories, as Renee has done with the film on PBS. To understand our community today, though, of course, it's critically important to understand a little bit about our community history, some of which is shared in the PBS documentary, but I thought I'd give a brief overview. So as you likely know, South Asians began arriving in the United States in larger numbers beginning in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And those who were coming at that time were coming primarily to work as laborers. So they're working in fields, factories, farms, lumber yards, mills, and primarily on the West Coast in California, in Washington State, and Oregon, as well as the western parts of Canada. There were small numbers of individuals who were able to come for other reasons, including this photograph from 1914 of members of the Illinois chapter of the Hindustan Association of America. So anyone who has gone to college recently will undoubtedly have like a SASA or an Indian Student Association. This was the 1914 equivalent. There were organizations of South Asian students in the US to help acclimate and create networks of students here in the US who had immigrated from India recently. There were remarkably few South Asian women who were allowed into the United States in the early 1900s because of very restrictive immigration policy in the United States. And one of the stories that's shared in the PBS documentary is of the Bagai family, which is a very tragic and heartbreaking story ultimately, and I'll share in more detail in just a second. But this is actually an article from 1915 describing the arrival of Kala Bagai in the United States, and along with her family, and it was so remarkable because she was one of the very few South Asian women in the country at that time. And there was an article in the San Francisco Chronicle about her arrival, but conveniently one that doesn't really talk as much about her as it does about her nose ring. So it says, "Nose diamond, latest fad, arrives here from India." But the reality, as you know, that these immigrants faced from South Asia and other parts of Asia as well, was one of incredible hostility and xenophobia and racism. This is an article from 1906, as you can see, titled "Our First Invasion by Hindus and Mohammedans," and another from 1907 titled "Have We a Dusky Peril? Hindu Hordes Invading the State." And just a few months after this article was published in Bellingham, Washington, small town Washington, lumber town, there was a race riot in this town where the group of Punjabi Sikh laborers who had settled in this town was violently chased out of that town by an angry mob of white men. And this anti-immigrant xenophobia and racist sentiment was also reflected in Congress and in both legislative and judicial decisions. In 1917, Congress passed the Immigration Act, which basically drew a line around most of South Asia and parts of Southeast Asia and banned immigration from those parts of the world to the United States. And I think what's remarkable about, once again, thinking about how history is relevant to our conversations today, it was almost exactly 100 years to the day after this 1917 act was first passed that President Trump signed the first executive order Muslim ban in 2017. And of course, famously in 1923, the US Supreme Court in the United States v. Bhagat Singh Thind decided unanimously to bar South Asians from becoming American citizens on racial grounds. This is an article from 1923 describing that Supreme Court decision. As you can see, it's titled "Hindus Too Brunette to Vote Here," and there's a caption of a South Asian man with a quote with a caption that simply reads, "quote unquote, the problem," giving you a sense of the ethos in this country at that time. And so, as Madeline talked about in good detail, so I won't cover it too much, this was really the law of the land until 1965 with the passage of the Immigration Nationality Act of 1965, which opened the doors for my parents, and I would undoubtedly say many of our families, to come to the United States for the very first time in larger numbers. But as Madeline pointed out, this act also used professional expertise or educational pursuits as the qualifying factor in who was allowed to come into the country. And so we, of course, joke about why there are so many Indian American or South Asian American doctors or engineers. That's, of course, a direct result of immigration policy and who has been allowed to come into the United States, and just as importantly, who's been not allowed to come into the United States. So I want to actually turn now to share a short video with you that we're going to be premiering tomorrow. So this is a bit of a sneak peek, I would say, and one where we try to really bring these stories from 100 years ago that are incredibly relevant today and use them to think about how we can activate our communities today. This is a story that expands on the story of Vaishnav Das Bagai and his family and is told from the perspective of his granddaughter. So I'm just going to play. It's a short video. It's about 2 minutes long with you now, and hopefully this will all work.
Why does your vote matter? Well, allow me to tell you a story. This is my family. My grandparents came here in search of a better life for themselves and their 3 sons, including my dad. They arrived in San Francisco just over 100 years ago in 1915, but it was a time of xenophobia and racism, particularly against those from South Asia, like my family. Shortly after my grandparents arrived, Congress passed a new law banning South Asians from becoming American citizens. But just 2 years later, his dream was shattered. In 1923, the Supreme Court made it illegal for South Asians to be American citizens. My grandfather's citizenship was nullified, and he was left without a country to call his own. This destroyed him, and sadly, a few years later, he took his own life. In a letter he left behind, he wrote, "I came to America thinking, dreaming, and hoping to make this land my home. I established myself and tried to give my children the best American education. But they now say, I am no longer an American citizen. Now, what am I? What have I made of myself and my children? We cannot exercise our rights. Is life worth living in a gilded cage?" It was more than 20 years later before the laws were changed, and South Asians, including my dad and my grandmother, could finally apply for American citizenship. This is why voting matters. I hope my family's story is a reminder of what we've endured to get the rights we have now, how easily they can be taken away, and how hard it is to win them back. If you haven't yet, please register to vote right now. And please, please vote in November.
So as I said, I think that our histories can be really powerful starting points for really engaging and activating our communities today. And so the last thing that I want to share is this is a screenshot of the SADA website. Our URL is just sada.org, saada.org. All the stories and materials that I've shared with you in the presentation, the talk so far, are freely available to the public there. But as I mentioned, we are undoubtedly living through a historic moment right now with the pandemic, with the upcoming election, et cetera. And so we started a project about a month ago called Letters from 6 Feet Away, where we started documenting South Asian American experiences during COVID-19. And in this project, we basically ask people to write themselves a letter, follow a number of prompts that we provide, and write themselves a letter 1 year in the future with the memories, with the lessons, with the revelations from this time that they want to hold on to. And one thing that for me, I think was personally really important about this project is a more optimistic framing. The hope that a year from now, things will be better. So we'll be looking at this in the rear view. I really hope that's the case. But like I said, we provide a number of prompts, such as during my time is being spent, the pandemic made me realize, I can't wait to stop being socially distant from, etc. And we've received a really overwhelming response, almost 120 responses already to this project. One aspect of it that I'm also really in front of is that a year from now, we'll send people these letters in the mail. So they'll receive a literal letter from themselves from the past, from this period. I'll end here, but I just wanted to share the URL for this particular project, sada.org/letters, and would invite anyone who's watching now to contribute their letter to themselves. And then once again, the URL for our website, sada.org. Thanks very much, Hannah.
Thank you so much, Samip. It was a lot to take in, and we really appreciate this time you've shared with us to give us this overview. It's a lot to pack into only 15 minutes, and we hope that this can certainly be only an opening into further conversations. And I think you certainly address this really deep linkage between history and our own civic engagement today, and why turning to history is important in that regard. So I want to turn now to our next speaker, Ashley Cheng. So Ashley, so the company you founded, Rouser, brings together creative work and civic engagement. And as we've seen in the documentary, stories like that of Anna May Wong and Sesue Hayakawa in Hollywood remind us that race, politics, and culture are deeply, deeply intertwined. So what was your experience like watching this documentary? What does activism look like for you now with your company and podcast? And why does civic engagement and participation also matter to our creative community and the work of AAPI artists and writers? So it's a whole lot that I just asked you just now, but I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, as you mentioned, I co-founded this creative civic engagement company, Rouser, and I'm a co-host of the Rabble podcast. And our whole mission is to make it easier for all people to become activists and engaged in Texas politics, and to make it really fun while we're at it. And for me, watching this documentary, it was just so tremendously validating to have a clearer picture and an understanding of sort of the history of activists and civic engagement, and even that intersection of culture and arts and entertainment, because I think that's what we do with the Rabble podcast. We're fusing all of that, the intersection of social justice, of civic engagement, and of entertainment, right? And so it was really wonderful for me to be able to see that reflected more in my history. And now I've done a lot more self-reflection also about my own identity as an AAPI woman over the last few months in quarantine, probably than I ever have in my whole life, largely because I feel like we're in such a moment for AAPI voices to be lifted as a reaction to all of the negative rhetoric that we're seeing out there as well, related to the way people are talking about the virus. And I think I've been able to unpack some of the quiet ways my own internalized racism has shown up in how I interact with the world. And I think watching this PBS documentary was a large part of that too. And, you know, women especially, but even AAPI men are often told to be quiet, subservient, you know, don't show your anger. And they talked a lot about this in the documentary, and how this rose up a lot in the 1950s, this like keep your head down, work hard, but never complain. And I kind of hate this next phrase I'm going to use, because it just kind of grosses me up for some reason, but it's useful. It's a useful one too, which is the idea of the bamboo ceiling, right? Like, yes, please be a good American, a model minority, but please don't expect like any power in return. Don't expect to have a seat in office, and don't complain about it. So to me, you know, when you ask about what does activism look like as a member of the AAPI community, I think that can just be the sheer act of putting your voice out there in the community in whatever capacity and whatever way resonates for you, right? So growing up, I was never one to even raise my hand in class, even though, you know, like I knew all the answers. But as an adult, I don't think I ever really spoke out about politics or racism publicly because I didn't want to offend anyone, right? And I wanted to be perceived as polite. And now I co-host a podcast where all we do is talk about politics and racism every episode. And, you know, I've never had any aspiration for any kind of political office in my life. I never would have even dreamed of it. And now I'm running to represent APIs as a member of the Democratic National Committee. And I never would have expected that. And so I feel like for me, it started out in very small ways and evolved into something more. So I think I never would have set out thinking like, oh, I'm going to run for this big national office to represent so many people. But I started out with, I'm just going to show up and learn, right? To listen to other stories. And then eventually, for me, at least personally, I developed the confidence to use my own voice. But I think when it comes to activism, that something is better than nothing. And when people don't expect us to speak out, that's an act of resistance in itself. And anything we can do to disrupt our systems in small and large structural ways, I feel like, yes, let's do it, sign me up. So fill out the census. That is an act of resistance, right? The system doesn't expect us to do that. They build it in a way so that it's hard for communities of color, hard for our communities, AAPI communities, especially when you look at the diversity of languages. There's an added barrier for communities. Drop off flyers at Asian restaurants and grocery stores to hand out about the census. Tell all of your aunties and uncles and grandparents and grandchildren to make sure they're counted in the census. Support AAPI businesses, that's an act of resistance. Donate or volunteer to AAPI candidates and those that also actively reach out to our communities, that's an act of resistance. I think of Kathy Cheng, who is running for Texas Supreme Court. We so badly need role models and leaders like that on a state level. You're about to hear from a pretty awesome candidate also, Sri Kulkarni, and he is running for Congress. And in our history, we've never had an Asian representative that we've sent to DC from Texas, and he could be one of our firsts. We also have Seema Ledgervardian running in Texas 2. You should check out her campaign. Dr. Pritesh Gandhi is running in Texas 10, which is my district. He's got a primary coming up in July, so check out his campaign and see what you think. Here locally, if you're watching from Austin, some of my dear friends, Pooja Sethi is running for city council, and Margaret Cheng Kirchner is running for a judge position. So there's tons of folks out there who are jumping into leadership positions that we can support. And I think taking the time to reflect on how you can be a part of that conversation in whatever way makes sense to you, whether you become a precinct chair, lead your kid's school's PTA, anytime you believe in yourself enough to even put your name out for a leadership position, that in itself is an act of resistance, right? Organize. Henna Rafiq is the AAPI organizer for the Texas Democratic Party. I don't know if there's a Republican version of her, but I'm sure you could Google one and look that up as well. Lastly, vote. That is the ultimate act of resistance. When I look out at the majority of political candidates out there, hardly any of them are taking AAPI communities seriously. So make sure that, as they're not looking at us as a voting bloc, so let's please just prove them wrong this cycle and vote, right? That's a huge one. And then next up, thinking about how AAPI communities can be in solidarity with other communities of color. I mean, we are not a minority group. We just have to do the work to build true solidarity within the AAPI community, but also with other people of color and other indigenous communities and populations. I mean, we're literally the global majority. So that's something that we need to make sure we keep in mind as well. And when we think back at the documentary and our history also, we can't honor the death of people like Vincent Cheng, whose birthday just passed, May 18th, and his anniversary of his murder is coming up. He died on June 23rd of 1982. And when a group of auto workers in Detroit attacked him because they blamed Japan really for killing the auto industry. And, Vincent Cheng is a Chinese man. And so in the end, his murderers were only ordered to pay $3,000 and serve 3 years probation with no jail time. So we can't honor his life without also honoring in that same breath and fighting against the systemic racism that's killing our Black siblings like Trayvon Martin, Sandra Bland, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Michael Ramos, right? So many. And, we need to take a step back and think about also how the same systemic racism and white supremacy that is using the terms to talk about this virus right now in our lives in a way that endangers all Asian communities. It's the same systemic racism that's also disproportionately killing Latinx communities through COVID-19 right here in Austin right now. There was a report that just came out. And I'm sure Dr. Shu could speak much more eloquently on this topic, but and she has already. We've learned so much that there is this history of us working together in solidarity. And I know that for me, when I think about my family, they first immigrated from Taiwan to the US in 1969. And I don't know if that could have happened had it not been for the civil rights movement that was largely led by Black Americans that enabled the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 that we were just talking about. So I would say just keep sharing. We need to keep sharing our collective stories. Rouser Rebellion is a great organization here locally. Regina Cumberbatch is the founder of that, and she wrote a great op-ed in this. She talks about how we don't need allies, right? We need co-agitators. And I love that phrase because we need people who are willing to build solidarity and put themselves out there actively, right? So that we're shifting our whole perspective and moving through life with a mission to identify and dismantle white supremacy. So keep speaking out against those small instances of racism that you see that are reflected not only against our community, right? But all communities out there. And then reflect on the ways that you uphold stereotypes within yourself too. And it's going to be uncomfortable, but it's way more uncomfortable for people of color out there today, all of us who are still living in fear. So there's other organizations I want to shout out before my time is up that are great local organizations to follow from when we're thinking of allyship outside and co-agitation outside of AAPI communities, from the Workers' Defense Fund to JOLT to Measure to the Austin Justice Coalition. So if you're on Facebook or near Facebook, give them a quick search right now. And then know that when you show up to those spaces, which will largely be virtually and in a Zoom room right now, make sure that you're doing a lot of listening and not centering yourself and your struggle when it's someone else's space. And the more we do that, the more we keep showing up, the more others will also keep showing up for us within our AAPI communities as well. And then the last sort of chunk of your question asking about how culture and why does civic participation also matter to our creative community and the work of AAPI artists and cultural creators. I was actually just invited by the Austin Family Support Services of Austin to lead an hour-and-a-half training this morning on the importance of storytelling for all of these movements. But I'll try to be way briefer than that. I think I have like 4 minutes left. So I think it's important to note that, if you, like me, never thought you would ever run for a political office, and maybe you have a talent as an artist. My co-host, Kristen Gunn on the Rabble podcast is actually speaking on a panel about the intersection of art and activism at the Texas Democratic Party State Convention next week. That's really worth checking out. But, the arts and various forms of storytelling can help to build empathy and relatability and a sense of belonging for all of us. And that's why it's so important. But there's even been research done that shows that perspective taking through stories can lower prejudice and discriminatory behavior towards marginalized groups. So we need to keep uplifting these stories and this work, and that's why representation matters in the arts. I mean, when Crazy Rich Asians came out, it was this insane movement of folks feeling so validated. And, we need to fight for inclusion and diversity in our political leadership, of course, because that's how we get systemic change. And that's why you need to stay on to listen to Sri Kulkarni talk in a minute about his campaign for Congress. But the work of artists is helping shift not just the way we see ourselves and finding that sense of belonging and validation, but how we create that larger cultural shift too. So we need that to get everyone on board to dismantle white supremacy and fight all the ways people of color are marginalized. And there's so many different mediums available to us to produce, if that's your thing, but also to consume and to share with others. So if people have favorites, I'd suggest that you start dropping them in the comments of wherever you're watching from and share those with others. I'll name a few of my own. Obviously, I run a podcast, so y'all should totally check us out and subscribe to the Rabble and check out our new series In the House, which is all about flipping the Texas house from our houses. But there's another podcast that just came out, a project from the LA Times called Asian Enough, where their 2 LA Times writers are interviewing different Asian celebrities about their own experiences growing up. My favorite graphic novel is called American Born Chinese by Jean Wen Yang. Definitely worth checking out. It's a really easy read while you're in quarantine. And I know that y'all are probably doing a lot of Netflixing at home in quarantine, so I would highly suggest shows like Never Have I Ever by Mindy Kaling. Kim's Convenience is another favorite of a lot of folks. Any Ali Wong special, The Patriarch by Hasan Minhaj. And these next ones aren't AAPI specific, but we have a responsibility for solidarity and to understand other stories. And I think Jane the Virgin is one of my favorite examples of entertainment that acts as civic engagement. And if you like documentaries, Ava DuVernay's documentary, The 13th, is another one that helps you understand the intersection of race and justice and mass incarceration in the United States. So I would definitely say check all of those out, share whatever else that you guys love out there as well. And I'm exactly at 7:20, so I'm gonna close up my remarks. Thank you guys so much for listening in, and make sure if you like what this next guy is about to say to throw him a few dollars if you can spare and sign up to volunteer for him, because he's doing really fantastic work in our community too.
Thank you so much, Ashley. And thank you so much for sharing those resources as well, and recommendations. We have some young viewers in our audience as well who actually submitted a question about what kinds of resources a young member of our community can consult as we learn more about AAPI history and culture. And so you set that up just very nicely. And without further ado, I'm going to turn to our last, but certainly not least, speaker of this evening, Shri Preston Kulkarni. So Shri, I'm going to turn to you as we reflect on the question of political power and electoral representation, especially as it was discussed in the documentary. It was really interesting to learn more about Patsy Mink, the first woman of color and first Asian American woman elected to Congress. You are, of course, running to become the first Asian American in Congress from Texas, paving an important path forward for our community and for our state. What has it been like for you watching this series, especially in this moment where you have demonstrated so much courage in committing yourself to public service and running for Congress? Could you also unpack some of the more pressing issues facing Asian communities today? But you can also broaden that out to communities more beyond the AAPI community. And why is it so important for the Asian community to have more electoral representation? Okay, I'm going to stop there and turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, it's both a pleasure and an honor to be here with you today on this extremely distinguished panel. And I did not pay Ashley to say all those things just now about our campaign. And by the way, if you have a little bit of support to throw to us, you can. But if you're a student out there, if you want to volunteer, if you speak another language, we also need that kind of help in our campaign, because we are striving to be the most inclusive campaign ever in the history of Texas, hopefully in the history of the United States. Just to unpack some of the questions that you asked just now. In terms of representation, I can't tell you how important it is for me. To be honest, I was not supposed to be here. There isn't a history in our community of encouraging our young people to go out and run for office. I didn't see a lot of examples. I actually grew up in the classic immigrant household that you hear about, where we had 9 people living in a 2-bedroom apartment when I was growing up right here in Houston. And there weren't many Asian Americans as members of city council or state representative or Congress or governor or anything like that growing up. And so I didn't have those sources of inspiration. But when I went overseas to serve as a foreign service officer, part of that pride for me was representing the diversity of America and American values in particular, that value of equality, of encouraging people from all over the world to come here and to find their American dream, whether they come from China or Vietnam or Pakistan or India or Africa or Latin America or Europe or anywhere in the world. And so that was a point of pride for me, and it helped instill in me some of those American values, that commitment to service, those things that bind us all together. Coming back here after seeing a lot of the demonization of immigrants, whether Asian immigrants, whether Latinos, whether Muslims over the last few years, I think it's extremely important for all of us to realize that being an American isn't just about coming here, starting a business, making money for your family. There are certain responsibilities that come along with that. And for our entire community, when we see things happening, when we see certain groups being treated differently, it shouldn't just be about our specific community. It should be about what's happening in the culture broadly. So when an Asian American family is attacked in Texas, it doesn't just affect our community, it affects all of Americans. But when someone drives across Texas to El Paso to murder a Latino family in a Walmart, that doesn't just affect the Latino community, that affects all of us. Or when a synagogue is attacked in Pittsburgh, or an African-American church is attacked in Charleston, or when the Muslim community is attacked or threatened to be banned from the United States. All of these things affect our entire society. And when I talk to young people all the time, I was talking to a group of Muslim students not too long ago who said, what can we do about Islamophobia? Because we are outnumbered. And I said, yes, if you think of yourselves as just Muslim students, of course you're outnumbered by definition as a minority. But if you think of yourselves as Muslim students and Hindu students and Chinese students and Vietnamese and African students and Latino students and all of us that believe in a progressive democracy, that is the majority, both here in Texas and across this country. But we have to think of ourselves that way, and we have to think of our collective interests. And so for me, being able to come back home and run for Congress. And I also have to say, Ashley, I'm really proud of you for running for office yourself. Every single person that I've talked to has been an inspiration to me, whatever they're running for. So I appreciate that. But to be able to be the first Asian American ever elected to US Congress from the second largest state in the country is an especially important point of pride, because the first of anything means that we have broken a barrier. A lot of people know that Texas is the land of cowboys and barbecue, and maybe the land of tacos as well. But we don't think of Texas as the land of pho or the land of curry or the largest Muslim state in the country, which it is. These are the changing perceptions that we have the responsibility to show to people, and part of that again is making sure that our generation, as well as our parents' generation, those immigrants who came here, that they get involved as well. A lot of people who don't know the history that we shared today don't realize that most of us, very few of us, have grandparents who were actually born in the United States. They weren't allowed to come during that time. My father came here in 1969. And so that wave of immigrants that came here, when they started their businesses, most of the time the pressure on them was to assimilate and to keep their head down. Well, at this point in our country's history, we don't have the luxury of keeping our head down, because if we don't all stand up with our heads held up high with pride, then we become a target. And so the kind of issues that are affecting the Asian American community, many of them are the same ones that affect all of us. So our community is extremely concerned with healthcare. It's extremely concerned with education. It's extremely concerned with climate change or gun violence in our schools. However, there are some things that particularly affect us. So for example, right now in the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, we disproportionately represent healthcare workers. And so I know so many people who are on the front lines right now who are fighting the pandemic. Those are the heroes that are risking their lives to try and save others. When people look at an Asian American as someone who is less American, every single one of us knows that feeling of being asked, where are you from? And then the very next question is, where are you really from? No matter whether you're born in the United States or not. And we have to change that perception. We have to make sure that never again will someone, say the President of the United States, be able to tell a sitting member of Congress, go back to your home country, because this is our country. And it's not just a matter of words. All of those people that were physically threatened, it starts with that perception. It starts with the kind of leadership that we show. And so I think it's critically important. And I'm so proud of all of the young people who have come to join our campaign, all of the people who were part of our campaign last time that was the first in the country to run in 21 different languages. So anybody out there who speaks another language, in some other campaign, maybe having an accent would be a bad thing. In our campaign, it's a great thing. It's an advantage because it means we can talk to more people. So if you speak another language, or if you don't speak another language, but you care about inclusion in our society, then I would love to have you all join us in our movement, because this is actually the antidote to all of the hatred, the anger, the division that is spreading across our country. It's not to get more angry at other people. What we always say is if students are being terrorized in their schools, like they are right now, don't get angry at gun owners, get more students involved in the political process. If women's rights are being taken away, like they are in this country, don't get mad at men, get more women involved in the political process. And if immigrants or the children of immigrants are being demonized in this country, like they are, the answer isn't to get more angry. The answer is to get more inclusive. Diversity is who we are in Houston, in Texas, in America. But inclusion is what we do. We have to make that effort to connect with all of these communities, to give them a voice. If we're able to do that, like we have in our campaign, we can make profound change. Last time when we first started, people told us, don't bother with the Asian community because they don't vote. Well, it turns out that 72% of Asians have never been contacted by a Republican or a Democrat. So maybe they don't vote because we don't bother. And I was told the easiest way to lose an election is to talk to people who don't vote. We said the easiest way to never get change is to keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. So we did it. We specifically reached out to all of these communities, their faith groups, their language communities across this district. We got 30,000 people to show up in 2018 who hadn't even voted for president in 2016. And then after that, we registered another 40,000 people in our district between 2018 and 2020. We are on pace right now to register 60,000 people. That would be 1/4 of the margin that Ted Cruz won the entire state of Texas by in 2018. That's the power of reaching out to these communities. That's the power that we have if we actually do the work. If we're willing to talk to people who may not have voted before, people who may have thought that politics doesn't affect me. I tell people, even if you don't do politics, politics will do you, because politics is our roads, politics is our schools, it's our air, it's our water, it's everything that affects our families and our communities. And so that's the task that we have right now. Those of us that are watching are already engaged, but we need to make sure that our communities, our parents, our uncles, our aunties, everyone who may have thought that the only thing that was important was to come here, start your business, keep your head down, they realize that we don't have that option anymore, because their children, the ones growing up in the United States, if we don't fight back against this hatred, this bigotry, this division, then their children won't have the same rights as others. The kind of targeting, it doesn't matter what your income is. It doesn't matter how much wealth you have. You can look at Germany in the 1930s. The Jewish community was very wealthy. You can look at the Indian community in Uganda, for example, but they could all get kicked out of the country. You can look at the Japanese American community here in the United States, who was put into concentration camps in our own country. All of these things have happened before. So all of that intellectual capital, all of that financial capital that our community has built, it means nothing if we don't invest it into political capital, into actually having a seat at the table. Because if we don't have a seat at the table, then we are on the menu, and all of us deserve to have a seat at the table. So if we collectively realize the threat that we're under right now, that the 2020 election is literally the most important election of our entire lifetimes, then we can push back this wave of hatred, of anger, of division and bigotry that's spreading across our country, and replace it with values that represent our community and represent America, including reason, compassion, and decency. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sri, and thank you again, sincere thanks to all of our speakers. So I'm now going to open it up for a more open conversation. We've been getting a stream of really great questions from our viewers. And so actually, Sri, your last point is a nice lead into this first question. So one of the challenges facing the Asian Pacific American community, like many other communities of color, is mistrust of government. and the role that this mistrust that the important role that government plays in our lives. So how can we help our communities restore our faith in public life and mobilize our communities to become more engaged in civic and political affairs? So for example, how do we convince an AAPI community member to get counted in the census if they're convinced that it's not going to affect them?
Yeah. So I'll take that, I guess. So usually what I do is I talk about the things that our community cares about. So why do we move into neighborhoods for good schools, right? Because we want our children to be well educated. We want them to have greater opportunities. But if you don't fill out the census information, that's what's used to determine where schools are going to be built, where roads are going to be built, what services your community is going to have access to. It also determines the services that come from the federal government to our community. It determines the representation that we're going to have. The fact that our community has been growing so quickly. Our district, for example, is the fastest growing district in the entire country right now. We're bigger than 5 states in population. But if we don't fill out the census, then we will get undercounted. So we won't have that kind of representation when they redraw the lines, when we choose our representation. And that's one of the reasons why we don't have a seat at the table right now. We don't have representatives. If you look at our Congress right now in the country, we have had representatives elected in California and Washington and Illinois, but in Texas, look at our state legislature, look at our congressional representation. We still have never had the first Asian American. And to be honest, without being too political here, you can also take a look at who's in power in Texas. The Republican Party, if you take a snapshot of the Republican Party in the Texas legislature or in the US Congress, does not look like America at all. If you look at the Democratic Party, you have people from multiple faiths, multiple ethnicities. You're having more of a gender balance. The Democratic Party is a place where we have an opportunity to actually have real representation, but it takes us joining together with other communities too. Like I said, don't think of yourself as just the Asian community, but the Asian community, African American, Latino community, all of us growing together with everyone who believes in a pluralistic democracy. And those activities that we take on right now, just like filling out the census, will impact your children and your grandchildren for generations to come.
Thank you so much, Sri. Does anyone else want to answer that question? We have a few.
So I think they did take the citizenship question out of the census. And so that aspect that might make some people liable to being detained, et cetera, is taken out. So that kind of information is not included. It's also something that should be considered a component of your rights to privacy, that you shouldn't have to reveal it unless there is some sort of warrant at play. I'll also say that in principle, and this is a Supreme Court decision that was decided on the basis of a case originating in Texas, Plyler v. Doe. In principle, people who do not have legal status actually do have rights to certain kinds of social services. In principle, things like schools, people need to be educated. And this is part of a strain of philosophy called social citizenship, right? That if we share our communities, if we share our neighborhoods, if we're sort of participating in the same sort of ebb and flow of everyday life, of communities, of employment, many people are paying taxes, many people in fact are business and homeowners, that in fact that should gain you purchase and belonging in the United States. I mean, in our present situation, it does not actually confer the formal legal status, but we have to continue pushing at that envelope to try to get these changes to happen in terms of sort of general values, but also in terms of laws and institutions. And so one of the ways we can do this is to participate in that census. And then, as Ashley has been urging, to vote, to participate in the political process. If we have those legal rights to do so, we need to act on it, right? And to try to continue expanding the ways in which we actually are able to claim those rights that we have.
I've got a really quick one. I love to tell people when it comes to the census that it is the easiest way to make $15,000 in like under 10 minutes, because that's how much your communities would lose in all the services that Madeline and Shri are talking about right now for your community over the 10-year period, since the census only happens every 10 years. So my family members love that one.
It's a very compelling number for sure. So I'm going to turn to our next question, which is actually from one of our co-chairs of the AACCC, Sumit Dasgupta. I think that some of you have already addressed this, but his question is, the documentary Asian Americans chronicled the sacrifices of Asian in building this country, but at the end, they paid a heavy price. They were denied citizenship, they were imprisoned in concentration camps, they could not own land, etc. What must Asians do to ensure history does not repeat itself, since the Trump administration has shown how easily established norms can be overturned or laws ignored?
Yeah, from my perspective, I think the first thing that we need to do is to know our own history. I think, as Sri was pointing out, we often don't recognize the historical precedents for what we're doing today. We don't see ourselves reflected in the American story often. And speaking very personally for myself, I grew up, my parents immigrated also in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and didn't really see myself reflect in the American story in what I learned in high school, what I learned in college. And it wasn't until I really began exploring on my own, learned about stories like that of Dalip Singh Sand, of Congressman Sand, of Bhagat Singh Thind in the Supreme Court decision in 1923, that I began to realize that our communities have been part of making this country what it is today. And so I think that's the first thing, is that there is a process of self-education that needs to happen in our communities to ensure that we recognize the ways that our communities have been targeted in the past, and recognize our place in creating solidarities and building solidarities with other communities that are being targeted today. Obviously, our communities are as well, but I think ensuring that we do not think of our struggles as only our own, that we see our shared struggles with other communities of color is crucial to being able to ensure that these histories don't repeat themselves.
Thank you, Samip. So we have a lot of questions this evening, so I'm going to try to address as many of them as we can, but also have enough space for discussion. So our next question is, in addition to the thunder that is outside of the window. So what do you think was missing from the PBS series? What could have made it richer or fairer?
So I'm the historian, right? And you're always going to have a huge list, right, of all the things they wish you wish that they had done. But I will say, for this documentary series, I think they did a wonderful job in terms of finding families and finding individuals with very complex histories, right? And I think it serves very effectively to really humanize these very kind of difficult sets of historical experiences and problems and challenges that Asian Americans have faced. But I think that narrative strategy means that they aren't able to talk as much about sort of the structural reasons why Asian Americans and other groups of color are marginalized historically, and the ways in which those power dynamics operate and then are legally enacted and are institutionalized. And so this is to answer the question about, what can we do, which is to pay attention and to realize that actually many populations are sort of left with lesser rights and protections because that's embedded in the United States legal system, right? And so for all the sort of proclamations of how the United States acts as a democracy, in fact, you just need to look at that history, as Samip has been talking about, to know that it's really an uphill battle, right? And that all of these different groups in different ways actually are rendered without the full rights of citizenship, right? And the access to the ballot box, and these protections in the case of immigrant populations from detention and deportation. And that we need to form these coalitions, and we need to just recognize that actually it in fact is going to entail a certain amount of struggle, right? That you can't just sort of be complacent and assume that everything will be all right, and that it's not just sort of your own narrow set of interests, right? There are many, many people are affected. And so to be actually, I think many people have awoken to and are paying attention to the ways in which so many aspects of of egalitarian protections, right, of shared common interests, shared common goods, is actually more and more being allocated along very, very unequal lines. And those inequalities are only increasing right now. So, and then Ashley has all of these very many helpful suggestions of concrete ways in which you can act up.
Really appreciate it, Madeline. I did mean to credit where the question was coming from, and actually it was from a community member named Naoko Waki. So Naoko, thank you again for that question. So our next question is from Joseph Margatanti. There's been talk of how quickly the model minority myth has turned back into yellow peril in our current pandemic with the rise of hate crimes. To what extent do you think that is true? And that's a question for you all to take up.
So one of the things about being the model minority is that it doesn't mean you become just sort of a regular American, right? The very point of the model minority is that you remain of color, you remain marked, and that's how you demonstrate, right, that the United States is a multiracial democracy. And so we never lose this taint of being other, of being foreign, and at times like this, after 9/11, with the coronavirus pandemic, it's just frightening how quickly this reemerges, the racialization as being foreign threats. And as I was listening to Shri and Ashley talk about sort of becoming involved politically, I was reminded of the 1996 campaign finance scandals, which was the first time the Democratic National Committee systematically tried to go out and recruit donations, not just Asian Americans to vote, but also Asian Americans to give donations. And that just blew up because the sort of the Republican candidate, Bob Dole, started accusing the Democratic National Committee of getting illegal campaign donations that were linked in terms of media representations. And actually, there was a congressional committee that came to this finding that it was somehow linked to this plot to influence the White House politics on behalf of China, right? I mean, it's just sort of shocking, and also just a real learning experience about how readily and how sort of wildly you could have these paranoid perceptions about Asian American political participation, right? But this doesn't mean you sort of roll over and be quiet. It means that you have to continue. You recognize sort of even more the nature of the challenges and the sort of the perniciousness of the challenges that are facing Asian Americans seeking to, greater voice, greater visibility, greater influence in the United States.
And I'll say that, sometimes there's this perception because the Asian American community economically is on average more well-to-do. That's true in Houston, Texas, across the country. So they can't possibly be the targets of discrimination then because, we live in nice neighborhoods or are successful in our profession. But as I mentioned before, historical examples are littered with cases where certain groups might have been doing well economically, like the Jewish community in Germany or the Indian community in Uganda. And because of that, they're actually targeted more because there's envy if there's economic upheaval like we have right now. What do? You try to scapegoat someone else. You try to find someone who's the source of your problems. And then to that point earlier about what do we do in response to it, I think the most important thing that we can do is to form coalitions, because I've seen it happen before where if the Muslim community is targeted, people say, I'm not Muslim. That doesn't affect me. Maybe it'll divide the Hindu and the Muslim community. Or if I'm not Chinese, then it doesn't matter. And actually, China is to blame for all of this. What's the harm in calling this a Chinese virus? And you see this fracturing among all of these Asian communities, all of these minority communities. The only way that you're able to actually push back on this is that if all of us, again, all people of color, all immigrants, all people who believe in this kind of democracy actually come together and speak with one voice, whether it's a Burmese family, Burmese American family in Texas being attacked, or whether we're talking about an African American who's being killed because they're in the wrong place at the wrong time, or they're being accused of a forgery. All of these things affect all of us, and we all need to raise our voices so that it's not just when our community becomes attacked, we think of ourselves as part of a larger American community.
I really appreciate your responses. Sure, I think you touch on a really important point, which is that part of what happens when with the pattern of scapegoating a particular group is that it actually deflects the conversation, deflects the attention away from what's really important, which is government response and then the collective responsibility that we have to one another. So I just want to come back to this question of the model minority myth once again. So because of the immense pressures of assimilation, as we witnessed in the documentary series, it may sometimes feel easier to, quote, keep your head down, work hard, and stay silent. Why do we still have a deep-seated mistrust of government? Why does it feel easier, despite all of this history of discrimination, to believe in the model minority myth? Why does this myth still have so much power in even within our own communities?
Well, that's part of how it's so pernicious and so powerful, right? Because I think it really channels values and aspirations that, in fact, many people have, not just Asian Americans. I mean, I think it's particularly strong among immigrants, right? Because you make those sacrifices and you move because you want to be able to create a better life, sometimes for yourself, a lot of times for your family members. And it's just, there's tremendous drive involved in that. And that's what the model minority myth does. I mean, it traps many Asian Americans because of course you're going to pursue education if you can. Of course you're going to try to build up your business, try to accumulate capital, have your house. I mean, these are very sort of human instincts, right? But then the way that it's so powerful is that it then positions Asian Americans against other minority groups, right? And it seems to suggest that, well, if Asian Americans can do this, why can't you? And part of it has to do with, Asian Americans, the majority of us did not get to be here in this United States until we were already well educated. We were already well set on these paths, right? But if you are somebody who is actually striving to attain upward mobility from within the United States, if you're down and you're sort of at poverty levels or working class levels and you're trying to move up, it's in fact incredibly difficult. Right? And this importation of this highly achieving immigrant group, this brain drain group, masks those problems in our democratic society, right? So it's not just about race, it's also about class. And it's, and it's very, very difficult because, I think many, and I think this is true in my experience in Austin, many other groups, African American and Latinos, will look at us and say, why are you complaining, right? You already have so much, not also seeing this history that, in fact, that we share. And then also the value placed on building coalitions, right? I mean, that's just another hurdle that Asian Americans seeking sort of a more egalitarian society have to work with and against. And so it's, but that's also the nature of a democratic society, right? Things are not set in stone, and you work with this aspiration that things can still be changed, right? That the direction can be turned. And, and this is why people go out there like Shri and like Ashley and try to assert leadership, right? Try to present a vision of how we can be different.
That's right. And I think what your point just now, Madeline, leads to this next question, which I do want to come back to, mentioned by Ashley earlier in her remarks. But how do we build bridges among our different historically marginalized communities, not just among our diverse Asian American communities, but also with the Hispanic Latinx community and the Black African American community?
One of the things I also wanted to say before we got into that is that there's still a lot of importance of building bridges within our AAPI community. And when we talk about the model minority myth too, I think, for people in my family, it goes along with the myth of, and I swear this will relate back to your question, Hannah, when people in my family, we really, there's a story of like, we've lifted ourselves up by our bootstraps, and the idea of the myth of meritocracy. And you don't want to feel like that's not true if you've made it. You know, I come from a family of restaurant owners, small business owners, and entrepreneurs, and like you don't want to take away from what you've worked for. So I think that's part of the pull, the lure of it for those of us who are better off, right? When we're not reflecting on the fact that a lot of people didn't show up in this country with boots to lift themselves up from, you know, to find those straps, then that's a problem. And we need to also do the work of disaggregating data, which I think Dr. Hsu talked about earlier in her remarks too, of looking within the AAPI community of how we need to lift up and just pay attention to what's going on in so many different communities across the board. And I think bridging that sense of solidarity, I think, starts within the AAPI community, and there's also so much work to be done outside. And I think that starts with, I think Samip mentioned this really well, the idea of just knowing your own history. I think that's a part of it, also knowing the interrelatedness and how intertwined all of our histories are as immigrants, as communities of color, as indigenous populations, and the fact that we need to continue to tell their stories, and also the history of how our stories are so intertwined. I think the documentary did a lot of that, but I think we just need to keep at it, you know, and figure out different ways we can message it, and showing up to their spaces and lifting them up, and then never, you know, being really mindful to also listen to other people's stories and their perspective too.
Thank you, Ashley. So speaking of history, our last question of the evening, it's actually coming back to this question of what books or resources that you all would recommend for young members in our, but also, you know, not necessarily young, but for anyone who wants to kind of pause and relearn Asian American history, and also just American history more broadly in terms of learning this intertwined shared history. So in addition to all the amazing resources that you shared, Ashley, Civic, can you also remind us where we can view the clip, the movie that you shared with us earlier?
Yeah, so we're just going to be putting on our website. Tomorrow will be on YouTube tomorrow, which shares the Kalabagai, the Vaishnava Bagai story in some detail. I'd also recommend, I mean, just in terms of kind of building on your question, would want to suggest kind of building on the theme that I was sharing earlier in my remarks of not just thinking about printed resources or movies or documentaries, but also thinking about your own networks and the people in your life as a really important source for learning. Your parents, grandparents, family members, friends, neighbors, and others from our communities, and really trying to understand their perspectives and their experiences, and how they can help us expand our own understanding of what it means to be South Asian American or Asian American or a person of color in this country.
I can say, you know, from the process of pulling together these communities for our campaign, I've heard so many stories of coming to the United States, you know, of say a Chinese American real estate owner right now who couldn't get a loan when he first got here, and he had to go to the Chinese community because he would either get rejected or get a higher rate of interest. And it's not the kind of thing you think about the Asian community suffering from. Maybe that's, you know, the African American, Latino community, but all of us have experienced these things. And so I've heard so many of these stories. But I'd also say to people out there who are listening, you know, history is also living. We're making history right now. I used to have this almost activist envy when I was growing up, looking at these documentaries about the 60s and the fight for civil rights in the United States. Well, that fight is taking place right now. I don't have that envy anymore because I worry every day about our democracy being taken away, about those fundamental things that make America, America, the things that, you know, I stood for overseas, the things that we all believed in, that our parents believed in when they came here, are being attacked right now. And so if you really care about those things, watch the documentary, think about our history, and then come out and join a campaign right now and help us make history in 2020.
Let's see. Hannah, I will forward this to you. I have a student who is working in education, and she's explicitly trying to develop a curriculum for K through 12 teachers in Asian American studies, Asian American history. And I know she's compiling resources, so I can forward that to you. And that should work across different grade levels. And so there's different kinds of readings that are appropriate for, you know, different ages of children. So this is just an online resource, but this was mentioned earlier, the Teach Immigration History website at immigrationhistory.org. It's really intended for general audiences, but also for teachers of high school U.S. history and civics courses to provide sort of factual but nuanced information about immigration history. There's a extensive chronology, and there are also different thematic write-ups. And so there's a section on Asian migrations, but then also migration within the Americas, women and migration. And it allows you to see sort of the intersections of how different populations have been regulated by immigration laws and also regulated in terms of who gets to be citizens, right? And I think it is really important to understand the ways in which, the policies, the laws, the institutions of the United States really, actually can serve to generate significant inequalities, right? And this is why people need to be involved, and you need to exert what influence you can in order to change that, right? And to make the democratic ideals expressed, with the founding of this country actually become more real. And so, I'm so glad to participate in this session. It's been really wonderful to spend time with all of my fellow panelists.
I already gave a really long answer for resources. So if you're just tuning in, you should just rewind when I rambled on and on about all of the forms of media that I love. But I wanted to give one more book recommendation, which I haven't read yet, but I'm going to purchase right now and read during quarantine. It's called The Good Immigrants: How the Yellow Peril Became the Model Minority, by my fellow panelist, Dr. Madeline Shu. So you should definitely check that out.
Thank you, Ashley.
I'm
That's very kind of you.
I'm very educated after reading this, after hearing her speech tonight.
Well, thank you all so very much for sharing these resources. And we will be sharing these with all of our viewers following this conversation. So as we wrap up, I just want to take this time to thank you again for joining us. Thank you to everyone who has been watching on the AACCC Facebook page, Shree's Facebook page, as well as the Rabble Facebook page. If you haven't already done so, do take the time to maybe rewatch or share the documentary series Asian Americans, which is still streaming on PBS right now. And of course, get yourself counted if you haven't already at my2020census.gov. And if you've already been counted, share it with your friends and your family, your networks. Check with people that that are near and dear to you to see if they've completed their census. And then finally, contact us with any questions. We'd love to hear from you. You can follow us on our Facebook page, which you're on right now, and also our Instagram handle, which is AACCC 2020. And again, you can also visit our website at AACCC-ATX.org, which is right behind me. Thank you all again, everyone, for joining us this evening, and have a good night.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you.